You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Let's preach. Let's talk about what we're talking about here this morning. So we are in a series that we started a few weeks ago called, Hey, Come for Dinner Tonight, where we are framing the gospel. We are rediscovering the gospel, perhaps, is a way of framing it. But we're seeing the gospel as this sort of invitation, right? This idea that within this invitation to, hey, come for dinner tonight, within this proclamation of the gospel are all the facets of the gospel, right? Like all the courses of the dinner party, all the food that we're going to eat, all the conversation and the jokes and the camaraderie with friends, all of that is part of this party, this invitation that you and I are invited to. And so we said at the beginning that at the outset of this, that the story of Jesus is the gospel. The euangelion, the good news, if you were with us a few weeks back. And we said from his birth to his ascension and kind of everything in between, everything in the midst of that, we talk about that as the fullness, the good story of the good news of the story of Jesus. And then we asked ourselves, well, what's good about it? Because the story of Jesus is compelling. It's certainly interesting, right? Like it's a fascinating read, but what makes it good? And that's sort of the question we are exploring in this series. And last week we talked about how the person of Jesus reveals to us who the Father truly is. That in Jesus, we now finally have this perfect revelation, this perfect understanding, clarity of who our Creator is. What is his nature? What is his character? What is his disposition toward us? How does he see us? And Jesus shows us how Jesus sees us. And that is good news because what Jesus does is it dispels all of these fractured, wounded images that we carry of God. And yet, we closed the service last week with this somber reality that even though Jesus reveals who the Father is, why do we persist to our own detriment and to the detriment of the world with these wounded images of God? And that's a challenging thing. And that kind of leads us to our second reason or rationale as to why the story of Jesus is good news. Because it provides a way back to God, a way of healing, a way of taking this fracturedness and putting it back into its wholeness, into its completeness. And that implies then that we are in need of healing, right? That we are not perfect as we are right now. Let's be honest. We are sick. We're wounded. And I really, personally, I like this language of sickness or woundedness. Some people will say we're broken. Some people say we're fallen. And some of these terms, some of this language is better than others. But I think we can all agree that we are not currently as we should be, yeah? Like this state that we are in as humans and as a creation is not as it is intended to be. We live in a beautiful world, right? There's beauty and there's just wonder all around us. There's no question about that. And there are so many things in life that bring us joy and satisfaction and pleasure. And we can celebrate that. But we would be lying to ourselves if we framed our world and this experience of life as perfect, because it's not, right? There are wars and conflicts and climate change and family tensions and YouTube ads that you can't skip through, and all those kinds of things that just kind of like grate on us, that remind us that this is not as it should be, right? That there is something else happening. And so it doesn't take much to convince us that part of the human dilemma that we are faced with as followers of Jesus, or not even as followers of Jesus, as humans, that we are faced with is confronting a world, confronting other people, and even confronting ourselves with the truth that this is not as it should be. That you're not whole, that we are not as we should be. And there is this longing in each of us for things to be made right. New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who says a lot about this kind of stuff. He wrote this: the power of the gospel. If you're a big fan of N.T. Wright, this will align well with you. If you're not, well then, let me introduce you to him. The power of the gospel lies in the fact that it addresses and answers that longing of the human heart that I just talked about. The longing for justice, for spirituality, the longing for relationship, the longing for beauty. These are not simply accidental quirks of the way that we are made. They are central, he says, to who we are. And the gospel offers the promise of their fulfillment, not necessarily in the way that we expect, but in a far deeper and richer way. Listen to this, he says, the restoration of creation itself. I love that. The restoration of creation itself. Anyone who is paying attention to their soul for just a minute will acknowledge this restlessness, this sense that things aren't right, and there's this tension, this desire for things to be made right. In a very silly way, I recognize this is silly and not meant to be made a joke, but this is my garage. And you have to understand how vulnerable it is for me to share a picture of my garage like this. This is taken yesterday. This is the very current status of my garage. And frankly, I'm embarrassed by this. During the summer, my wife's a caterer, for those who don't know, and so she has weddings every weekend. And so what we do is we take the tables, you can see some tables there, and we just fill them full of catering stuff. And that kind of it creates in me this sort of apathy, I don't have to worry about the garage now because Rhonda's got to do all our catering in it. And so I'll take tools out and I'll just throw them on the table when I'm done with them, and I'll take cords and I'll just kind of throw them wherever. And you can kind of see how amuck this garage is. And like I said, I'm a little bit embarrassed by this. And each time I walk into my space, I'm fully aware, right? This is okay, don't judge me. Or do, that's okay. Maybe it'll keep me maybe it'll get me back on the straight and narrow. But there's this tension that I feel when I walk into this space, into my garage. Every time I'm like, oh, things are not as they should be in here. Yeah? I just feel this sort of oh, this is such a mess. I want to, at the end of the wedding season, I'm going to come in there and I'm going to spend half a day or a day and a half, and I'm going to sweep it out. I'm going to put everything back on the shelves where they belong, and I'm going to restore it to its intended purpose and the way that it's designed to facilitate and hold all of my crap. But it's not like that right now. And so I promise you, though, I will clean that up, and so I don't want my garage anxiety to be transferred onto you. I will show you a picture in a couple of weeks when wedding season is done, and we'll get there, all right? So don't worry. But I feel the same form of anxiety, this longing for my garage to be restored. I have that same feeling for all of creation, including myself. And I think you do too. This is not some profound revelation I'm dropping on you this morning. This is the human condition that all of us are intimately familiar with. We know something's not right, something's broken, something's wounded and is in need of being fixed, healed, restored, cleaned up, right? And that's what we're yearning for. That's what our longing is for. And Wright is saying that the power of the gospel addresses this in its promise that creation itself will one day be restored. I mean, that's a beautiful promise. So we've been using, we're not using the space this morning, but we've been using for the last year and a half the space at Lac du Mille Lac School, 7th Fire generation. They bought that building from us, and then they allowed us graciously to continue to use that space. This past week, for the last year and a half, I've never really thought of what 7th Fire meant. I was just that's kind of a cool mascot for a school, I guess. And maybe you're that way too. Maybe you know the history. Well, I decided to kind of dive into it a little bit this week. And so this is the 7th Fire logo. And if you are familiar with this, then that's amazing. But if you're not, then maybe you'll find this interesting as well. So the 7th Fire, what does it refer to? This is a prophecy among the Anishinaabe people that is a key teaching of theirs. And the prophecy outlines the spiritual journey and the challenges of the Anishinaabe over 7 eras or 7 fires, right? And so the first 6 of these eras tell the story, the journey of the Anishinaabe people from their original sort of status in the West Coast and how they're migrated over to the Great Lakes area and how they kind of began living here. And it talks about the challenges along the way, in particular, when they began to find disintegration in their society and in their culture and in their language through, unfortunately, the arrival of European settlers and colonizers. And so we kind of came and disrupted their way of living. We disrupted their harmony. We disrupted their way of life. And so these first 6 prophecies or eras, not prophecies, these eras talk about how that kind of came to be. And then now this is their current reality, right? And so there is this fragmentation, this brokenness, this disintegration of everything in their world. From the people to the land itself, right? And everything in between. But then this 7th fire is a prophecy. The 7th era is a prophecy that represents a critical time of renewal and restoration for Anishinaabe. In this period, the Anishinaabe will return to the wisdom and teachings of their ancestors, restoring their culture, their language, their way of life. And this will be a time of healing for both the Anishinaabe people in their relationships with one another, in their relationships with the land, and in their relationships with non-Indigenous, non-Anishinaabe people. This will be a time of healing and reconciliation and restoration. And so there's this hope deep within the collective soul of Anishinaabe people that this current reality they experience will not always be so. That there will be healing in their land and in their souls. But notice the central theme of this prophecy is restoration, right? So there's this understanding, like in virtually every other culture and in virtually every other corner of the world, that things are not as they should be, that things are broken. And isn't it interesting that there is this language of restoration, of reconciliation, of healing, of being put back together the way things once were? So first off, how cool is it that our church has been meeting in that space that bears the name of a reference to restoration? I think that's kind of cool. But just more to the point, how interesting is it that it's not just within the Christian worldview that this narrative arc, this theme of brokenness and then a hope for eventual restoration comes to pass. Like, that's kind of cool. Because I think this is a universal yearning. Now, I want to pause here and I want to talk about sort of within Christian faith, within sort of the contemporary and even historical theology, there has been more or less 2 ways of addressing this wounded, fractured understanding of our world. There's what we call the retributive or escapist understanding, or the escapist gospel, retributive gospel, and then there's what we call the restorative gospel, which is what we've been alluding to already a bit this morning. And we looked briefly at the retributive or escapist gospel in our first week in this series, and this is what many of us grew up with, and maybe many of us still hold to that, and that's okay. I don't feel compelled to challenge you on that. If that's something that works for you, that's great. And so there is within this understanding of the gospel a very strong focus on sin, right? On punishment, on judgment. And the idea is that Jesus takes on the punishment that you and I deserve because of our sin in order to sort of satisfy God's justice or God's sense of God's judgment. And if the onus then is if you and I believe that, Christ's righteousness is being imparted to us. And so Martin Luther talks about it as, the reformer Martin Luther, he says something like, we are as white, what is it, snow-covered dung, I think is the lovely picture he paints. Right? Christ's righteousness is imparted on us, and God looks at us as just snow-covered, righteous, made perfect. And that allows us to then be in the presence of God. This is a very familiar understanding, right? So that when we die, we go up to heaven and we can be with God in heaven forever. We escape this broken, awful world and we go up to heaven. Or when the second coming of Jesus happens, whatever happens first, we will go up and be with Jesus. That's what salvation means within this framework, within this understanding of the gospel. And like I said, in many ways it works. I get it. And I think there's a lot of beautiful aspects to it, and there's a lot of truth in it. Is it entirely the gospel, like we said in the first week? No, I don't think it is. I think it misses the mark in some ways. And we can talk more about that. But I know there are many beautiful, Jesus-loving people who would subscribe to that understanding of the gospel, and they do beautiful, wonderful things in this world. And I would just say, carry on. Keep doing that. Personally, and this is for what it's worth, and it might not be worth much, I have leaned over the last 10, 15 years of my own faith journey, my own sort of development, my own worldview, more toward this latter understanding of the gospel, which is restorative. Right, so the first way, the retributive sort of escaping this world, understanding the gospel, this is, if you were to frame it, it is sort of we are being saved from God's wrath, or we are saved from God's judgment, right? We are being kind of like covered with Christ's righteousness, and then we can kind of leave this world and be with God. And again, it depends on how you understand God. But if this is how you understand God, great. But for me, this is not quite how I understand the scriptures to speak about the gospel. And I think there is a more holistic, and I would argue a more biblically substantive way of understanding the gospel, especially with regards to God as revealed in the person of Jesus. And I believe that rather than simply dealing with our sin so we can just kind of like escape this world, right, at the end, and be with heaven and be with God in heaven, I think that both the Old and the New Testament present a story not of abandoning the world, but of restoring this world. Not of being saved from God and his wrath, but rather being saved to a relationship with a God of love who invites us to participate in this ongoing work of creation restoration. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I find that far more compelling, don't you? The Bible emphasizes that God's work in Christ is not merely about saving souls for heaven, right? But instead about restoring creation, restoring our human relationships to their intended harmony with God, first and foremost, with each other, and then with creation itself. That's this salvation. That's what this is about. And so when that initial harmony, that initial shalom, that peace that comes from God was broken in the garden, God has been relentlessly in pursuit of mending it ever since, of putting it back together ever since. My buddy Bill is a big covenant theology guy, and I have learned much from him over just recently even. And one thing I learned is you study the ark of covenant all through the Old Testament, which is another way of saying God's promise to our people, to us, to first of all the people of Israel. And you see this covenant established with Noah and with Abraham and with Moses and with David and then with the people of Israel. At the heart of each of these promises is not, I will whisk you away, right? Like you can just burn the world down and let's get out of here. No, it's, I will be with you and I will restore you. I will restore you to me. You and me, God is saying to us, you and me will be restored. That's my end of the bargain, God's saying. I promise this to you. Right? And so we see this theme of restoration start right from the beginning. And because he's the fascinating Here's the fascinating thing about this, and I think any parent who has adult children would probably agree with this. And I do not have adult children, but I have spent a number of years just sort of quietly observing people in my life who I respect, who I'm like, man, I really love the relationship, peers of mine, adults, I love the relationship you have with your parents. It's so honoring and just lovely. And here's the thing I noticed. Here's something that has stood out, and I think you would agree with this, that when your kid breaks the rules, as a kid does, there are ways that we can handle that, right? You can punish them for doing that. And I don't think that it's always wrong to punish your kids. Maybe I'm a little bit off, but I actually think it's okay to do that. I think sometimes, whatever the situation is, maybe it requires something more than just the natural consequence of our actions. That's true, and I'd argue for that. But overwhelmingly, here's what I've noticed. Parents who kind of play the long game, who don't necessarily care about the immediate consequences of whatever it was that their kid just did wrong, who foster relationship, who value relationship with their child over punishment, over retribution. You see in those relationships strong parent-child connectedness in their adulthood. And when you have the confidence that you are loved by your parent, and you have just the sense that you are cared for, that you are protected, and that your parents are always there, and that is sort of assumed thing that you don't really have to think much about, chances are you're going to make good decisions in life. Not always. This is not across the board necessarily, but I'm just saying in general, this seems to be a principle of good parenting. Is not zoning in on the punishment, zoning in on making sure that you're being exacting the judgment on your kid, but rather seeing that in whatever happens here, there is a restored relation, that the relationship itself is being restored, is being maintained, is being sustained, and is being healthier all the way through. And in the end, you have healthy, happy relationships with your kids. And I know this is much easier said than done. I have 2 teenage boys, and so I recognize that very clearly. This is okay, it sounds great. But yeah, I think that this is the way that God the Father looks at us. I'm convinced that this is the approach that he uses in his relating to us. That he's more concerned about ensuring that relationship with him is maintained than making sure that we're punished for whatever it was that we've done wrong. And so restoration begins with restoring that first broken relationship between us and God. And last week we learned how through the revelation of God in the person of Jesus, we begin to mend this relationship, to restore it by healing those wounded images of God that we carry. And indeed, this is what Jesus was all about in his life and in his ministry. When Jesus decided to launch his public ministry, the very beginning, he's in his hometown. It's Saturday, because synagogue was done on Saturday, I think. And so he's in front of his crowd, his familiar people that knew him, right? And he asked to read from the scroll of Isaiah. This is in Luke chapter 4. You can follow along. I'm going to put the words on the screen. And he says this. So this is coming out of Isaiah. Jesus stands up in front of this home crowd, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then after reading this, the text in Luke says, "Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began by saying to them, 'Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.' What a fascinating story. This is how he begins his public ministry. So Jesus himself announces that this prophecy in Isaiah about the year of the Lord's favor is now being fulfilled in their midst. What is the year of the Lord's favor? Does anyone know? What's the word? Jubilee. Thanks, Scott. I knew my Bible thumping friend Scott would know. Thanks, buddy. Yes, the year of Jubilee. That's right. And this year of Jubilee is a reference all the way back to the Torah, to Leviticus 25, one of the original 613 commands that were given to the people of Israel. And this is a fascinating thing. So the year of Jubilee was to happen every 50 years for Israel, okay? And in that time, in that period of 1 year, debts were to be forgiven. All outstanding debts were to be forgiven. Land was to be restored to its original owner, to the original family. If you were being oppressed, if you were in slavery, you were released. What else? Slaves were released. It was the land itself laid fallow for a year so that it could be rejuvenated and revived the following year. In fact, in other words, all the things that sort of created this sort of societal disintegration were removed so that society could kind of restart, reboot. It was kind of like a giant reset button to happen every 50 years. Can you imagine a society that did that? The thing is, there's no account of it ever happening in Israel. Like it never took place. And, you know, maybe the people there that were listening to Jesus that afternoon were quite aware of the reality that they had never actually experienced the year of the Lord's favor. But there was this hope, right? This reality that was within their reach, that they had always longed for, that was part of their identity, but that they could never realize, never actualize, because Israel itself, for all of its history, never really had 50 years straight where it could do something like this. Or it was always with conflict or being oppressed by others, whether it was the Assyrians or the Babylonians kind of took over, right? And then after that were the Persians and then the Greeks. And then now they're living under Roman occupation. Like it was just one power after another that came and oversaw the Israelites, that prevented them from being able to actualize, being able to realize this year of restoration. And so it's deep within their psyche, their collective psyche, that this is what we long for. And then Jesus comes on the scene. He reads from the prophecy of Isaiah that speaks to this. And he says, today, this restoration begins in your midst. This is happening, friends, right here, right now. So you can imagine how this would be received as good news, especially if you were caught in the cycle of poverty, or if you were one of the vulnerable who were being oppressed. This is who Jesus came for. He came to set you free, right? He came to set you free. And so they're like celebrating, like, whoa, isn't this Joseph the carpenter's son? This guy's amazing. And they're just like very excited about Jesus coming from their, he's one of their own. They're very happy about this, right? This Jesus is proclaiming this, wow. But then Jesus continues, right? And this is what he says. He reads, starting at verse 25, I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time when the sky was shut for 3.5 years. And there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed. Only Naaman the Syrian, who was an enemy of Israel. Keep that in mind. So all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way, which is kind of a cool part of the story. But here's my point. The people of Israel listening to this story originally, they're like, yeah, Jesus has come to give us, God's chosen people, the year of Jubilee. And they're all about that. They're all excited to hear that. Yeah. And then Jesus says, wait. And he reads or references stories from their own sacred texts about how God showed favor to non-Israelites, right? To people outside of the chosen people. Because Jesus is saying here, I didn't just come for Israel. I have come to restore everyone everywhere, right? This is not special to just Israel. This is for all people. And in Paul, in the gospel, or in the book of Romans in chapter 8, we see Paul talking about creation itself, all of creation, yearning, desiring for it to be made right, for it to be restored. There are these pains, this groaning that goes on, right? In Ephesians, Paul talks about this cosmic plan of restoration in which all things in heaven and on earth will be reconciled in Christ. And that same language of reconciliation takes place in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it's actually interesting when Paul talks about it here. He says there is this ministry of reconciliation. Read it 5:18 and 19 or around there. There is this ministry of reconciliation that is being given to you and me. That we are carrying out that reconciliation, that restoration into the world we go into. Like this is not just for God to enact. It's God to enact through us. Reconciliation, restoration. And you can fast forward to the last two chapters of Revelation. Chapters 21 and 22. And here we see the vision of John. And do we read a story of, God coming up and taking everyone away to heaven? No. In fact, we see the opposite. We see heaven coming down to earth. Verse 3 says, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them. They will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eye, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning or crying or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. I mean, that's hopeful. It's beautiful. And verse 5 says that, behold, God is making all things new. And so these final chapters of the Bible paint a picture of a future without a curse, where God's presence fully restores and renews this creation, allowing humanity to live in eternal relationship with him. Sometimes we need this reminder. Like, this is a big story, and it's hard to wrap our heads around that. And I think sometimes we read these scriptures, we read these words, and we're like, yeah, that's pretty cool. But stop and think about it. Like, if that's the truth, if that's the thing that is a conviction of yours, I mean, that's a beautiful story to live into, isn't it? To be a part of, right? Here's what N.T. Wright says about this. He says in Revelation 21 and 22, is not a vision of a world abandoned and left to decay, but a world made new. The new creation, which is promised in Christ's resurrection, is a world in which heaven and earth are rejoined, put back together as it was intended to be. In other words, what we're taught in the Lord's Prayer, to pray for God's will on earth to be as it is in heaven, will now finally be realized. This prayer will come true, will be answered. And so Jesus enacts this restoration through his death and his resurrection. And then through the Spirit's presence with each of us, we carry it on, enacting God's will in heaven here on earth. And so this is the good news, friends. This is the hope of the gospel. That in the resurrection of Jesus, we not only witness victory over death, but we see in Jesus this new creation emerging, these first steps toward the restoration of all things, the healing of a broken and fragmented world. And the hope is that no matter what awfulness you watch on the evening news at night or through your social media feed, or how terrible your own circumstances become, and I do not want to make light of our pain and suffering. That's real. And that sucks. But the hope of the gospel is that it will not always be like this. That one day there will be a restoration of your circumstance, of your relationship with God, with others, and with this creation, this good creation. One of my favorite quotes is a good quote to end on this morning. One of my favorite quotes by C.S. Lewis is from his book, The Weight of Glory. Weight of Glory is actually not really much of a book. It was originally a sermon that he delivered. How many people have read The Weight of Glory? I thought so. Look, this is the kind of church that would read The Weight of Glory. That's great. If you haven't, you should read it. I know I probably have shared this quote before because it's one of the things I live by. I actually have it on my office in the basement. It's on the wall. And I reference it often, and it's just it's a beautiful piece of poetry is actually what it is. It's a picture that C.S. Lewis paints. There's a lot of P's there. It's a picture that C.S. Lewis paints of the redeemed, restored earth, restored world. And he's not talking about escaping to a new world that doesn't exist yet, that's way up there in the sky. No, this is what he says. At present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. And I love this part. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Right? Someday, God willing, we shall get in. He's not talking about escaping from this earth. He's talking about the promise of a restored, healed, new creation, a new reality that we can scarcely comprehend right now. One that allows us to experience the splendor of God's good world without barrier. I mean, that's good news. Here's my challenge for us this week. Take a picture of this or Google this. And I want you to meditate on this quote. Just every day, if you do devotions in the morning or whatever, just consider these words. Consider this poetry. Consider what is being said by Lewis here. What are the profound implications of a restored creation that you and I get to be a part of? That all of creation gets to be a part of? I think it'll work on you the way it's worked on me over the years, and it will continue to. Lewis just has that way with his words. And what if we can start living into this restored world right now? What if you and I can start being active agents of carrying on that restored world, of creating that restored world in our midst, in our workspaces, in our schools, right? Wherever in the shopping mall, whatever it looks like to bring about healing. That's the role we get to play. And I'm going to talk about more about this partnership, more about this in the weeks to come. But let's just leave it here this morning. Let's turn to communion. I'll invite Matt to come up. I think this is just a good thought for us to end on. Yeah? And this is the promise of the good news of great joy for all people. That there is this hope of restoration, and it's being felt, it's being made real in our midst right now through you and me, through his Spirit with us. And so I was just looking at the lyrics for Beautiful Things, and I was like, man, what a perfect song that was to begin this message on this morning, that God is making beautiful things out of the dirt, out of the pain and the sorrow and the brokenness. This is the way God works in this world. He takes that brokenness, he takes that pain, and he makes beautiful things. He's always been like that. Always. Amen? All right. Let's turn to the bread and the cup. This is for those who are new, this is something that we do every Sunday. We participate in this communion together as a church family, and all folks are welcome to the table. We look at the bread as a symbol of Jesus' body broken for us, and of the juice as his blood spilled for us, speaking to the cross, speaking to this beautiful moment in history where it seemed that we lost. It seemed that the whole thing, the whole project was a failure. And then 3 days later, new creation begins, right? We celebrate this resurrection. So this morning, let us participate in that. I don't know how we're going to do that because we have a bunch. But you know what? In classic grassroots style, I'm just going to invite you to come to the table, gather around it, take a piece of bread, dip it in the juice. You're welcome to the table.